The contract reads 6 months. Standard Compact Logistical Support Agreement. Class C Auxiliary Personnel. Non-combat designation. 1 human, me. They'd even put it in writing that I was not to be considered a security asset, not to be armed, not to be consulted on defensive protocols. I was there to run the facility. That was the whole of it. I signed on the 15th of verath-cycle 9, 2 weeks before the Compact delegates sealed the outer blast doors of Bunker Salithkas, and settled in to wait for the world above to finish its business without them. The crisis they were hiding from was one they'd started. I knew that going in. You don't take a 6-month underground logistics physics contract without doing your reading first. And the reading was not subtle. The Vethrani Compact had been squeezing 3 tributary systems for a decade. Extraction levies, transit tolls, mandatory conscription quotas that the tributary populations had been absorbing and absorbing and absorbing until they stopped absorbing. When the first transit hub went dark, when the second conscription depot burned, the Compact's senior council looked at their projections, looked at each other, and decided the most elegant solution was to be somewhere else until the numbers improved. Salithkas was 40 meters of reinforced ferrite plate under a dead mountain on a moon that nobody had mapped because nobody had wanted to. It had its own water recyclers, its own atmospheric scrubbers, its own food cell arrays, its own power stack. It could sustain 16 occupants for 2 years on full rations, 4 years on reduced. It had been built to Compact specifications by Compact engineers and then handed to a logistics contractor, me, because the Compact's senior council, for all their administrative precision, did not know how to change a scrubber filter. I'm being uncharitable. Delegate Sevath Orvaldan knew how to change a scrubber filter. He'd shown me on the 3rd day. Walking through the maintenance corridor with his chiton gleaming under the work lights, both sets of arms folded with the kind of careful dignity that meant he was trying very hard to look like a man conducting an inspection, rather than a man need to ask which corridor the maintenance corridor was. I'd handed him the filter wrench. He'd made 4 attempts and then set the wrench on the conduit housing and told me the rest was my concern, so. His concern was policy. My concern was everything else. There were 16 of us in total, 5 delegates of the senior council. Sevath Orvaldan, Delegate Prime. Issel Kreth Voss, Delegate for Internal Compliance. Thovinar Solith, the youngest, barely passed his first molt. Rekdal Von, who ran the Compact's Tributary Assessment Bureau, and who had the look of a man who'd spent 40 years doing quiet damage and considered that a chew. And Yevara Anketh, who hadn't said 10 words to me in the first 2 weeks, and who I suspected was the only one among them who understood they'd actually done. 6 security personnel, blue chitinous, heavy-armored Vethrani guard caste, all of them carrying Compact issue, pulse weapons, and all of them managing the specific blanks alertness of soldiers who'd been told to protect principals and had not been told what from. 3 administrative staff, clerks, schedulers, record keepers. 1 physician, a thin-limbed medic named Osavel Threnkur, who took my blood pressure on day 1, handed me a data chip with the facility's medical inventory, and said, in accented but careful galactic common, that he hoped we'd be bored together. He'd also scanned my bone density and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, Class 19, I said. The survey team updated it from Class 17's last night's. The atmospheric methane gradient came in higher than the previous assessment. He said, and you grew up there, I said. Born and raised, he said. I'm going to note this. He made a mark on his clipboard. Not for any particular reason. Just because it seems like the sort of thing that should be in the record. I said, that seems reasonable. He'd nod, mark the clipboard and move on. He was the only one who'd looked at the intake manifest, seen my origin designation, and not made a face. The others had made faces. The facility ran in 3-day cycles tied to the atmospheric scrubbers. The scrubbers set the rhythm because if the scrubbers weren't happy, nothing else mattered. You got hypoxia before you got thirst, and you got thirst before you got hunger. And in a sealed installation with 16 warm bodies all exhaling and metabolizing, the scrubbers were the clock everything else was set against. 3 days on, 4-hour service window, 3 days on. I built the food cell rotation around it, the water recycler drawdown schedule around it, the power stack load management around it, The end of the first week, I had the full maintenance cycle running on a 12-page master schedule that I kept on a handheld because I didn't fully trust the facility's integrated systems, and I had learned a long time ago not to trust integrated systems in installations you haven't run. 4. The 12-page schedule had the blast door codes on it. Not because the blast doors needed regular cycling, they didn't. They had passive locking and would hold indefinitely. But because the override codes for emergency egress were tied to the same authorization chain as the scrubber and recycler systems, and if something went wrong with the atmospheric stack in the middle of the night, I needed every relevant code on the same document. It was just good practice. Nobody asked about the 12-page schedule. Nobody asked about the codes. That was the thing about Solith Kos. The compact delegates had built a machine they didn't know how to operate, hired someone to operate it, and then mostly forgotten that the machine was a machine. The scrubbers scrubbed. The recyclers cycled. Food cells were warm and regular. The power stack hummed at 62% capacity, which was right where I wanted it, because 62% gave me a 20% emergency buffer while keeping the draw even and cool. Everything worked. When everything works, it becomes invisible. The person keeping it working becomes invisible. That was fine. I'd done invisible before. I will tell you something about running a sealed installation that is not in any logistics manual. The first 2 weeks are the installation talking to you. Every system has a personality, a set of tendencies, for a range of sounds it makes when it is content, and a different set when something is developing. You don't learn this by reading the spec document, though you read the spec document. You learn it by being present, by walking the corridors at different hours, by putting your hand on conduit housings when the power stack is under different loads, by listening to the scrubbers in the dead hours when everyone else is sleeping and the facility is breathing at its natural pace. By the end of the first 2 weeks, I had a working model of Solith Kos in my head, a continuous background process that was always running and that would surface into full attention the moment something deviated. It was the same process I used on verath-six for other things applied to a different problem. The mountain doesn't care that it's a facility. It just has its patterns, and you learn them or you don't. The delegates never walked the corridors at 3 in the morning. They never put their hands on the conduit housings. The facility's personality was invisible to them, which was fine. That was what they'd hired me for. But it meant that the installation existed for them, only as a set of services delivered: clean air, warm food, functioning lights. The machinery that produced those services was abstract, and abstract machinery, in my experience, is the kind that surprises you badly when it stops. Month 2, Delegate Rek Dalvan called me to his quarters, which were the facility's primary room, repurposed. Because he'd decided the available bunk space was inadequate for a man of his administrative standing. He was seated at the briefing table when I arrived, his secondary arms folded behind him, and his primary arms flat on the table's surface. Mandibles, set in the position I had come to understand, meant he was preparing to condescend. He said the food cell output for the third cycle had been below the agreed caloric specification by 4%. I said the food cell matrix had flagged a thermal irregularity in the secondary growing chamber, and I'd reduced the cycle output by 4% as a cautionary measure while I diagnosed the issue, and that the irregularity had been a faulty thermostat coupling that I'd replaced from the spare inventory on day 18. He said that was not the point. I said I understood that he might have preferred to be informed in real time, and that going forward I would flag any precautionary reductions before implementing them. He said that was also not the point. I waited. The point was that a Class C auxiliary personnel designation did not carry discretionary authority over facility resource management, and that any modification to the agreed operational parameters required delegate prime authorization. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the 12-page schedule. I thought about the thermal sensor in the secondary growing chamber, which had been running 3 degrees warm for 6 days before the coupling finally gave, and what a 4% output reduction now looked like compared to what a full chamber failure in month 3 would have looked like. I thought about the fact that the spare parts inventory had exactly one replacement coupling in it, and that I'd used it, and that if the coupling had failed all the way and taken the chamber matrix with it, nobody in Solithkos had the knowledge base to diagnose the cascade, or the physical dexterity to pull and reseat the matrix board without destroying the adjacent nutrient feeds, I said. Understood, delegate. I'll document the authorization chain in the master schedule. He said that would be appropriate. I went back to the maintenance corridor and made a note in my schedule. I flagged the spare parts inventory for the growing chamber section and started a running list of components that had no backup. It was a longer list than it should have been. Month 3, the first of the administrative clerks died. It was the physician's business, not mine, and I stayed out of it. Asavel handled it with quiet efficiency. Cardiac event, he said. The stress of confinement, the diet change, the disruption to a sleep cycle that had been tuned for a different gravity and a different day length. The Vethrani were not built for sealed spaces. Their biology wanted open air and thermal variation. The facility's scrubbers kept the atmosphere clean, and the temperature steady, and the humidity controlled. And all of that was correct by the numbers. But the numbers hadn't accounted for what 6 months of the same air did to an insectoid nervous system that had spent 40 years calibrating to the open world above. The clerk's name was Tessin Val-On. I'd spoken to him twice. He'd been in charge of scheduling the delegates' daily briefings, and he'd always apologized for bothering me when he had to adjust the maintenance windows around them. I thought he was decent. After Asavel filed the report and the body was moved to the facility's cold storage, there was a compartment for it which I noted with the cold appreciation of someone who'd read installation specs carefully enough to know that the designers had planned for this. The delegate prime called a closed session. I wasn't invited. I didn't need to be. The ventilation system in Solithkos ran through a continuous loop duct that passed within 18 centimeters of every room in the installation, and the duct had a faint harmonic resonance that turned adjacent spaces into reasonable acoustic receivers if you knew the frequencies. I didn't listen in. I want to be clear about that. I had a scrubber filter to change, but I heard them through the wall of the maintenance corridor while I was changing the filter. And what they were saying was this: crisis above was not resolving on the projected timeline. The tributary systems had not collapsed. They had apparently organized. What the Compact's projections had modeled as a 12 to 16-week disruption was now entering month 14 with no clear terminal point. And the revised assessments, being relayed through Solithkos' encrypted comm array, suggested that certain Compact holdings in the outer tributary belt had changed administrative hands entirely. What they were saying, in the careful language of people who do not like to name things plainly, was that they might be down here for a while longer. I finished the scrubber filter. I updated the master schedule with the revised resource allocation curves for a 12-month extension scenario. Then I updated it for an 18-month scenario, because the food cell matrix had a growth efficiency curve that plateaued at month 9, and I wanted to know what the caloric output looked like on the far side of that plateau. It was fine. I had run worse numbers on worse installations. The stack was solid. The recycler was solid. And as long as nobody did anything catastrophic to the growing chamber, we could sustain 16 occupants through 22 months on standard rations with a 4% reserve buffer. 15 occupants now. I corrected the number in the schedule. Month 4, Delegate Issel Kreth Voss came to find me in the equipment bay. He was the delegate for internal compliance, which was a title that had meant something in the world above and meant less down here. And he had spent the past 4 months finding new ways to make it mean something again. He had interviewed every member of the facility staff at least twice. He'd restructured the daily reporting requirements so that the clerks spent their mornings filing situation reports that he read in the afternoons, and then filed responses to. The clerks then cross-referenced against the previous day's reports and noted any discrepancies, which Kreth Voss then reviewed. It was a system that generated a great deal of paper and kept people busy and told you nothing about anything. He had also, I noticed, been spending time with the security detail, talking to them separately, taking notes. He told me He was conducting a routine review of facility resource allocation. I said I'd be happy to walk him through the master schedule. He said that wouldn't be necessary. He'd reviewed the summary reports I filed with the delegate prime. I said of course. He said he had one question. I waited, he said. The blast door cycling protocols, they require a daily authorization code input. Who provides that input? I said that I did. The authorization codes rotated on a 72-hour cycle, tied to the facility's encryption clock, and the daily input was a maintenance requirement. And confirming that the primary egress systems were responsive and current, the code sequence was logged on the master schedule and updated each rotation. He said, "So you hold the current codes?" I said that was correct. He was quiet for a moment. His mandibles moved in a way I'd learned to read as recalculation. He said, "Is there a redundant code holder? A backup authorization?" I said the facility design specified a single primary code holder for the auxiliary logistics post. Secondary authorization reserved for the delegate prime or his designated security officer. Walk him through the handover protocol if the delegate prime wished to designate someone. He said he'd take that under advisement. He left. I updated the master schedule. I noted the conversation in my maintenance log, time-stamped, because I had been keeping a maintenance log since day one, and I kept it in precise, factual detail, and I had been doing this since before I could legally sign contracts because my first posting had been an orbital refinery on a moon with a 16-hour window between inspection cycles, and I had learned early that the most important thing in a facility you are responsible for is a complete record of everything you did and exactly when you did it. I didn't flag the conversation to anyone. There was nothing to flag. He had asked a reasonable facilities management question, and I had answered it. Month 5. The second administrative clerk died. Same constellation of causes. Cardiac stress, sleep disruption, the long accumulated weight of confinement on a biology that wanted open air. Savell filed the report. The body went to cold storage. The delegate prime called another closed session. This time I was doing an equipment inventory in the adjacent bay when they met. And I wasn't moving toward the duct or away from it. I was just working, and the duct ran where it ran. What I heard, Delegate Rec Dalvon saying that the auxiliary logistics personnel represented a source draw that was becoming difficult to justify on a revised timeline. What I heard, Delegate Isselkreth Voss saying that the question of the blast door codes had not been satisfactorily resolved. What I heard, Delegate Prime Seveth Orvoldans saying in a tone that was very careful and very quiet that any decisions of that nature would require documentation and he would not proceed without it. What I heard, Delegate Rec Dalvon saying documentation could be arranged. I finished the inventory. I went back to my bunk and sat on the edge of it for about 4 minutes. I thought about the installation. I thought about the master schedule. I thought about the 18-month resource curve and what it looked like with one fewer occupant. Then I thought about something else for a while. The thing about growing up on a Class 19 world is that the threat assessment runs constant, not loud. Loud is for people who haven't done it long enough to make it automatic. Loud means the signal is still surprising you. On verath-six, the signal is never surprising. You grow up reading ambient data the way other people read a room. Barometric drop, ground temperature, titicular stillness. That means something is moving through the grass 200 meters out, and you have approximately 40 seconds to decide whether you're moving or staying. You do it before you know you're doing it. It becomes the way you think. I had been reading ambient data in Solithka since month 1. I had been noting Kreth Voss's patterns, Dalvon's patterns, the way the security detail moved in the corridors, who they nodded to, who they gave space. I had noted which of the 6 guards seemed to be under Kreth Voss's particular cultivation, and which ones kept their distance. I had noted the food cell access logs which I ran daily and which showed me who was eating, how much and when, because stress metabolism in insectoid species is measurable in caloric draw, and I had been monitoring the drawing down of the Compact's collective anxiety by watching their lunch intake for 5 months. I should explain what I mean by ambient data reading, because it is not the same thing as suspicion. Suspicion is reactive. It forms after an event and looks backward. What I'm describing is anterior to that. A constant, low-draw survey of the environment that runs the way a background process runs. Below the surface of whatever else you're doing, surfacing only when the signal changes. You develop it on a world like verath-six because the world requires it. verath-six has 7 native apex predator classes, 4 of which are ambush specialists, and the 6th, the Threskavar, a tunneling pack species, iridescent flanked, roughly the mass of an armored transit vehicle, does not give you the courtesy of showing itself before it commits. You learn to read ground vibration, temperature gradient, the behavior of smaller animals in adjacent terrain. You learn to run a continuous survey and trust the survey to tell you when something has changed, before you've consciously identified what changed. Solith Kos had no Threskavar. It had 5 and a shifting political architecture, and 2 dead administrative clerks, and a delegate for internal compliance, who had been having private conversations with 2/3 of the security detail. The survey process was the same. The data was different. What the data was telling me, by month 5, day 19, was that the architecture had shifted into a new configuration, and the new configuration had a specific shape. They were afraid, not of the crisis above. They'd made their peace with that. The way people who've never faced a genuine threat make peace with things by deciding they're manageable. They were afraid of each other, and of time, and of the creeping recognition that the thing they'd built to keep them safe was also the thing that was eating them, slowly, one clerk at a time. And now they were looking for something to do about the numbers. I thought about this for 4 minutes. And then I started to plan. Let me be precise about what I planned, because I think precision matters here. I did not plan to hurt anyone. I want that on the record. I planned to be impossible to remove cheaply, which is a different thing. The blast door codes were part of it, but not because I intended to use them as leverage in the way Kretheth Voss feared. The way a hostage-taker uses. Leverage, theatrical and loud. I intended to use them the way a keystone is used. Not by pressing down, but by being exactly where everything else depends on. Here is what I knew that they did not. The blast door override system was not in fact a simple lock-and-key mechanism. It was a 3-stage authorization protocol. The daily code input, which I provided. A secondary biometric confirmation, which the facility's intake system had registered at installation and which had registered me, and a tertiary mechanical release that existed for catastrophic system failure and that required physical access to a manual override panel in the maintenance corridor, behind a conduit housing that required the filter wrench to open, that I had opened and closed 47 times in 5 months. None of the delegates or their security staff knew the tertiary release existed. It wasn't in the summary documentation I filed with the delegate prime. Because it wasn't in the summary documentation categories the delegate prime had specified. He'd asked for scrubber status, food cell output, power stack readings, and water recycler drawdown. He had not asked for egress protocol documentation. I had not volunteered it. This was not deception. The document categories were his specification. I had answered every direct question I had been asked, completely and accurately. I simply had not narrated the full architecture of the facility to people who had not asked to hear it. I also knew the atmospheric scrubbers were due for a full system service in 42 days. This was not a small service. It required an 8-hour offline window, a physical disassembly of the primary filtration column, the cleaning cycle, and a reassembly. I had done it once before, at month 2, at 3 in the morning, when the facility was quiet and I could work without supervision. On that occasion, I had taken 7 hours and 20 minutes. I could do it faster if I needed to. During an 8-hour scrubber offline window, the facility's atmospheric quality would begin to degrade within the first 2 hours, and would reach the threshold for cognitive impairment in the 5th hour for standard insectoid biology. The threshold for standard verath-six human biology was approximately 11 hours, because verath-six's native atmospheric methane gradient had spent a few thousand years doing interesting things to the pulmonary and neurological baseline of everyone born there. And the impairment threshold you developed at altitude, on a world that was actively trying to kill you was, not the same, as the one you developed in a controlled office environment on a compact administrative station. I was not going to use the scrubbers as a weapon. I want to be clear about that too. I was noting what I knew. What I planned was simpler. I planned to know everything and let them discover in their own time that they had handed everything to someone they decided they no longer needed, and that the process of undoing that decision was more complicated than it appeared. Month 5, Day 19. Delegate Rek Dalvan came to find me. He was not alone. He had two of the security detail with him, the two I had tagged as Krethvasses, Swoolies, the ones who'd been eating separately from the others, and whose caloric draw had been elevated for 6 weeks, which I had noted in my log as stress metabolic response to operational briefing, unconfirmed. They were in full armor, pulse weapons at the carry position. Dalvan told me that the Compact was implementing a facility restructuring in light of the revised operational timeline. He said the Class C auxiliary logistics contract was being terminated, effective immediately, with compensation to be settled upon resolution of the current crisis period. He said this with the tone of a man who has said things like this many times and found that the phrasing generally makes the problem go away. Was sitting at the equipment bay workbench. I had my coffee, one of 22 remaining single-serve packets, which I had been rationing against the extended timeline. I was reviewing the scrubber service schedule, I said. Understood. Shh. I'll need to brief whoever is taking over the logistics role before I can step away from the schedule. The scrubber service is in 41 days. It's an 8-hour procedure, and the person running it will need to have done at least one prior cycle to be safe. I can have a full handover document ready in. Dalvan said a handover wouldn't be necessary. I looked at him. Then I looked at the two guards. Then I looked back at him. I said, the scrubbers need to be serviced every 90 days. If the service window is missed, atmospheric quality degrades. The food cell matrix requires daily monitoring and a weekly cycle adjustment. The water recycler has a filter that needs changing every 21 days. The next change is in 8 days. Power stack requires a load balance audit every 14 days. These are not optional procedures. Dalvan said, the facility's integrated systems would manage routine operations. I said the facility's integrated systems would flag alerts when things went wrong, not before. Managing routine operations was what I was for. He looked at the two guards. One of them moved a half step forward. I picked up my coffee. I drank some of it. I set it back down, I said. Before this proceeds, I want to be helpful, so let me share some information that might be useful for your planning. Blast door primary codes rotate at, and I gave him the next rotation timestamp, the one 7 hours out. The secondary biometric confirmation is registered to me at intake. The tertiary mechanical release is in the maintenance corridor, behind the filtration conduit housing, accessible with the filter wrench, which is in the second drawer of this workbench. Open the second drawer. The wrench was there. I said, I'm telling you this because I want you to know that I'm not holding anything back and I'm not trying to be difficult. You can have everything I know. The question is whether you want it over the next 8 hours, which is what an actual handover takes, or whether you'd prefer to find it on your own. The guard who had stepped forward stopped moving. Dalvan's mandibles were doing the recalculation motion again. Faster this time, I said. Scrubber service is in 41 days. If you want to know how to run it, I'll show you. If you don't want to know, I'd ask you to tell me what you'd like me to do instead, because I am genuinely trying to understand the plan here. He left. He left both guards and then came back 20 minutes later and took them with him, which I noted. I drank the rest of my coffee. I updated the maintenance log with the timestamp, the participants, and an exact transcript from memory. I noted that the termination conversation had been initiated, not completed, and that no formal contract termination documentation had been presented. Then I went to change the water recycler filter 8 days early because I had decided I wanted it current. Month 5, Day 21. Delegate Primes Savath Orvaldan came to the maintenance corridor. He came alone, no guards. He stood in the corridor for a moment without speaking, watching me replace the secondary coolant line on the power stack, which needed doing and which I was doing. He's how much of this can you teach someone in a reasonable period? I said it depended on the someone, he said. A best case. I thought about the security detail, which of the 6 could probably absorb procedural training. I thought about the administrative clerks. the one surviving, who had been filing reports for 5 months and had a good procedural mind. I thought about Asavel, who was a physician, but who had the kind of lateral intelligence that tends to transfer well. I said, the daily and weekly procedures, in a month for a motivated person, the scrubber service, the food cell cycle management, the recycler maintenance, those take 6 weeks minimum before I'd trust someone to run them unsupervised. The blast door system and the power stack load management are 6 months before I'd be comfortable stepping away. He was quiet. I said, the tertiary egress release I mentioned to Delegate Dalvan, I can show you that in 10 minutes. It's not complicated. You should know where it is, he said. Why are you telling me this? I said. Because you're going to be down here for a while. Keys and the facility needs to keep running. And the most efficient way for that to happen is for more than one person to understand it. I would have had this conversation in month 1 if anyone had wanted to have it. He was quiet again, for longer. He said, termination conversation, I said. Yes, he said. Dalvan acted without my authorization. I said, I know. You told him you needed documentation first. The silence was a different quality this time, I said. The duct harmonic in the equipment bay runs adjacent to the briefing room. I wasn't listening. I was doing an inventory, but the duct carries. He looked at the conduit housing above us. He looked at the duct. He looked at me, I said. I didn't report it because there was nothing actionable yet. There still isn't. But since we're talking plainly, I'm not trying to hold this facility over anyone's head. I'm trying to keep 16 people alive on a schedule that is getting tighter, and I would very much prefer to have this conversation now, rather than month 7 when something breaks and nobody knows how to fix it. He said 15. I said 15, I'm sorry. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, show me the tertiary egress release. I showed him. Month 6. Delegate Isilkreth Vasis filed a formal complaint with the Delegate Prime, alleging that the auxiliary logistics contractor had exceeded her designated authority by accessing restricted communications infrastructure. The restricted communications infrastructure in question was the duct harmonic, which was not an intentional communications infrastructure at all. The Delegate Prime reviewed the complaint and found insufficient grounds. Treath Voss filed a second complaint, alleging that the contractor had withheld material facility information from the senior counsel. The material information in question was the tertiary egress release, which I had disclosed to the Delegate Prime, who had then chosen not to share it with the broader council, which was his prerogative. The Delegate Prime reviewed the second complaint and found insufficient grounds. Voss came to find me in the equipment bay on day 14 of month 6. He told me that my continued presence in the facility represented an unacceptable security risk. He was alone this time, just him, and the blank-faced administrative certainty of a man who had spent his career deciding what was and wasn't acceptable. I was eating lunch. There was a ration bar left from my personal stores. I had been saving it for a bad day, and month 6, day 14 was a moderately bad day, so I ate half of it and put the other half back. I said, Delegate Kreth Voss, I want to ask you something directly. He said he would hear it. I said, in 40 days, the atmospheric scrubbers need a full service. I'm the only person in this installation who has done one. The Delegate Prime and I have started working on a training schedule. 40 days is not enough time to fully transfer that skill to someone else at a safe level. If you terminate my contract before the service is completed, the service will not be done correctly, and the atmospheric quality in Solithkos will begin degrading in the following cycle. I'm not telling you this as a threat. I'm telling you this as a facilities management fact. He said the integrated systems could manage, I said. The integrated systems will alert you when the CO2 levels hit the threshold for cognitive impairment. At that point, you'll have approximately 3 hours before the alert becomes a medical emergency. The manual scrubber service requires physical access to the primary filtration column, which is behind a panel in the maintenance corridor. The panel requires the filter wrench to open. I can show you where the wrench is and walk you through the service documentation if you want to be prepared to do it yourself. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen before on an insectoid face. It was the expression of a man counting things and arriving at an unexpected total. I said, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm trying to be helpful. These are the facts of the installation I am responsible for. You can make any decision you want. I just want the decision to be informed. He left without filing a third complaint. Month 7's, Delegate Rec Dalvan had a cardiac event. Savell was with him for 6 hours and came out of the medical bay looking 10 years older. He lived. Savell was good. And Dalvan was strong in the way that mean men are often physically durable. But he was off duty for 3 weeks, and when he came back he was quieter. I noticed that his caloric draw went down. I thought about that. I thought about a man who had spent 40 years doing quiet damage, having a great deal of time in a medical bay to think about where he'd ended up and who was keeping him alive. I didn't say anything about it. It wasn't my business. Month 8, I ran the scrubber service. In the 3 days before it, Yavara Anketh came and found me. She was the one who'd said almost nothing since month 1, and that pattern had continued. She attended the closed sessions. She ate her meals. She filed whatever reports she was required to file. She moved through the facility with a particular quality of attention that I had noted and never quite had a name for. Not surveillance, not the strategic monitoring that Krethvas did. Something older and quieter. She watched things the way someone watches things, when they are trying to understand them rather than control them. She found me in the equipment bay, prepping the scrubber service tools. She watched me lay out the components for a moment. The filter wrench, the column clamps, the cleaning solution in its 3 separate containers, because you mix them in sequence and not before. And then she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes, she said. "Did you know, when you signed the contract, what we'd done?" I said. "I read the news. The assessment levies in the tributary belt, the conscription quotas. It wasn't hard to piece together," she said. "And you came anyway," I said. "You needed someone to run the facility. That was the job." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The people in the tributary systems, the ones the levies were taken from. What happens to them now?" I said. "That depends on the negotiation, but the provisional treaty was recognized by 4 adjacent systems, which is not nothing. They have standing now that they didn't have before," she said. "Because we hid," I said. "Because you left a vacuum and they filled it. You might have the same result if you'd stayed, or you might not. Don't know." She looked at the scrubber service tools for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for keeping us alive." I said, "It was the job." She nodded and left. I finished laying out the tools. I ran the scrubber service over an 8-hour window starting at 2 in the morning. Delegate Prime Orville Dan was present for the first 2 hours, watching and asking questions which I answered. 3 of the security detail were in the adjacent corridor in case anything went wrong. Per the protocol Orville Dan and I had worked out together. Savell had a medical kit. Nothing went wrong. 8 hours and 12 minutes from first panel open to last seal tested. I had the Delegate Prime confirm the atmospheric readings at the end. They were nominal. He said, "You have done this before," I said. "Twice now. And I've done harder versions on worse installations." He looked at the maintenance corridor, the way people look at things they have been ignoring and are suddenly seeing, he said. "Class 19 verath-six." Said, "Yes," he said. "The Compact's Assessment Bureau upgraded that designation 2 cycles ago." "From Class 17, I said. "I heard," he said. "What does that mean?" "Practical reality of it." I thought about how to explain it. I thought about what it means to grow up somewhere that has weather events that eat, townships, atmospheric methane swings that kill the unprepared, a gravity gradient that adds 11% body weight by the time you're fully grown and means your bone density reads like compressed rock on medical scans. I thought about what it means to have a nervous system calibrated to constant threat reading, to have a pain threshold that Savell had documented on day 1 and written a note about in his medical file and then said nothing further about. I said, "It means I'm not worried about the scrubbers." He almost smiled. Insectoid faces don't quite do it. The mandibles relaxed in a way that I had come to recognize as its equivalent. He said, "No. I imagine not." Month 9. Com Array brought a message. The first substantive message in 6 months. Encrypted, triple-keyed, routed through 3 relay stations. It took Orville Dan 4 hours to decode it and another 2 hours to be sure what it said. I was in the equipment bay when he came to find me. He sat down across from me at the workbench, which he had never done before, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The outer tributary belt has reconstituted itself as an independent administrative body. Provisional treaty status, recognized by 4 adjacent systems. The Compact's territorial claim is under formal dispute. Our holdings in the belt are frozen, not seized. Pending negotiation." I said, "That sounds like it might take a while," he said. "It might," I said. "How long do you want to stay down here?" He looked at me. I said, "The installation can sustain 15 occupants for another 14 months on current rations. If we reduce to modified rations and bring the food cell output up by shifting the matrix to the extended growth cycle, which takes 6 weeks to phase in, we can push that to 19 months. Or we can leave," he said. "The world above," I said, "isn't the same world you left. It's not uninhabitable. The crisis your projections were waiting out has been replaced by a negotiation. Negotiations happen in the open air." He was quiet for a while. He said, "There are people above who want to hold the council accountable for what was done to the tributary systems." I said, "Yes," he said, "and you're suggesting we simply walk out." I said, "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you the options. You can stay for another 14 to 19 months, and then walk out. You can stay until the negotiations resolve and walk out then. Or you can walk out now and participate in whatever process is above. Those are the options the installation gives you." "I don't have a preference," he said. "You don't have a preference," I said. "I've been down here 9 months on a 6-month contract. Preference is to complete the handover properly, close out the schedule, and go home." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me what opening the blast doors looks like." I told him. I walked him through all 3 stages: the daily code input, the biometric confirmation, the tertiary mechanical release. I told him how the doors moved, how long the pressure equalization took, what the atmospheric transition would feel like to insectoid biology coming from a sealed environment into open air after 9 months. I told him to let Ossavel prep everyone for about 2 days before the actual opening. Hydration, dietary adjustment, the specific nutrients that helped insectoid nervous systems manage the transition. He wrote everything down. He was methodical about it. He said, "Why didn't you leave on your own?" "You had the codes," I said. "Because I had a job to do and the job wasn't finished. And because walking out of a sealed installation without briefing the occupants first is how you get people killed if something goes wrong at the door. The transition protocol exists for a reason." He looked at me for a long time. His mandibles moved through several positions I had learned to read, and I won't describe all of them. The last one was the one I had come to associate with Ossavel's nod on day 1. Not surprise, not recalculation. Something flatter and more settled, he said. "I owe you 9 months of back pay," I said, "and whatever the hazard differential is on an installation that went from a 6-month to a 9-month contract under changed conditions. My agency has a formula. I'll send the invoice when I have connectivity," he said. "Of course." 11 days later, on a morning that I had selected, because the atmospheric pressure and thermal readings from Ossavel's external sensor indicated clear conditions above. No precipitation, no high particulate event, ground temperature with the comfort range for insectoid biology. I ran the opening sequence. Stage. The daily authorization code, which I input from memory, because I had been inputting it from memory for 9 months, and I knew the rotation as well as I knew my own heartbeat. Second stage. The biometric confirmation, which the INT register accepted in approximately 1 second. Third stage. The tertiary mechanical release, which I opened felt the filter wrench from the second drawer of the workbench in the equipment bay. I had brought the wrench with me in my pack afterward because it was a good wrench and the installation was no longer my concern. The pressure equalization took 4 minutes. The hydraulics on the outer door were original construction, and they moved with the deliberate, massive certainty of something that had been waiting for a long time to do its job. The sound of the seal releasing was the loudest thing I had heard in 9 months. Then the door opened. The light came in first, not the flat regulated light of the installation's panels. Daylight, actual daylight. Late morning and a little hazy, with the particulates that always hang over a mountain moon in the hours after dawn. It hit the corridor floor and went all the way to the back wall and illuminated a layer of dust on the conduit housings that the facility lights had. never quite reached. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The air smelled like rock and cold and something organic that I couldn't name. Specific smell of open ground that doesn't have a compact designation, but that I had been missing without quite knowing it. Behind me, I heard the delegates moving up the corridor. I heard Orval Dan's footsteps. I had learned the sound of every person in the installation over 9 months, which footstep belonged to whom, which pace meant urgency and which meant routine. His pace was careful, not afraid. Careful. I stepped out. The mountain above was gray and old and very large. The sky was blue-gray and clear at the zenith, hazy at the horizon. There was no sound except wind. I stood there in the light and breathed the open air and let the weight come off my shoulders the way it does when you've been inside something for a long time and you finally aren't anymore. I am from a world that would have eaten this moon for breakfast, and I know what hard looks like, and this moon was not hard. It was just open. I heard Orval Dan step out behind me, then two of the security detail, then Ossavel, who made a sound that I think was involuntary, the specific sound of someone who has been underground 9 months and has just remembered what a sky is. Orval Dan came to stand beside me. He was looking at the mountain. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, "What happens now?" I said. "Now you close the blast doors. I'll walk you through the exterior relock sequence. It's straightforward. And then you make contact with whoever is managing the negotiation process above. Recommend going through your legal bureau rather than the command structure, given the context," he said. "And you?" I said. "I file my closing report, submit the invoice, and arrange transport home." "Standard end of contract procedure," he said. "You? If we need someone to consult on the facility on the transition?" "Is that something your agency handles?" I said. "It's something I handle. Send the request through the standard agency channel, and I'll review it," he said. "I will." We stood there for a moment in the light. The wind moved across the mountain, and it smelled like nothing in the installation's climate-controlled air had ever smelled like. I pulled out my handheld. I opened the master schedule. I navigated to the final page, the closing case procedures checklist, and I began working through it, item by item, the way I had worked through every other item in that schedule for 9 months. Methodically, without hurry, because the job was not finished until the last item was checked. The delegates were standing behind me in a loose cluster, some of them looking at the sky, some of them looking at each other, some of them looking at me. Kreth Voss was looking at his feet. Dal Von was looking at the horizon with an expression I couldn't read from the back of his head. Young Thoven R. Solith, the one who'd barely made his first molt, came to stand near me and looked at the handheld and said, "Is there anything I can do to help?" I said. "You can hold this while I do the exterior panel relock." I handed him the handheld. "Don't lose it." He took it carefully. He held it the way you hold something that matters. I went to work. The relock took 11 minutes. When it was done, the blast doors were sealed from the outside, and the exterior panel was dark, and the mountain was just a mountain again. Took the handheld back from Thoven. I checked the last item on the closing checklist. I checked the item above it, and the item above that, all the way to the top. Everything was in order. I put the handheld in my pack with the filter wrench. I checked the time. Pulled up the nearest transit waypoint on the installation's external nav log, which I had noted on day 1, because noting the nearest transit waypoint on day 1 is the first thing I do at any posting, on any world, in any installation. 14 kilometers northwest, manageable. I told Orval Dan the transit waypoint coordinates and suggested he contact it for transport. I told him to mention the facility designation, Solith Kos, when he called, because the transit operators in this system would know the name and would not be entirely surprised to hear from it. He said, "Will you be with us?" I said, "I'll walk." He looked at the mountain and the 14-kilometer distance implied by it, and then he looked at me, and I think he was doing the calculation of what a Class 19 body says about a 14-kilometer walk on a quiet moon, with no weather event and no native predators and clear visibility to the horizon. He said, "Of course." I shook his hand. Vethrani's handshakes are a 2-arm affair, and he did it correctly, which meant he'd looked it up at some point, which I noted. And then I shook Ossavel's hand, and the physician looked at me with the expression of a man who had documented my biology on day 1. and spent 9 months watching me work, and had arrived, sometime in the last few months, at a conclusion he hadn't had words for at the start. He said, "I hope we meet again," I said. "Send the medical records through the agency when you get connectivity. I want them for my file," he said, already flagged. I nodded at Thovin, who nodded back very seriously. I looked at the group for a moment, 15 aliens standing in the open air, on a mountain moon, blinking in the daylight, alive, functional, in reasonable health, with somewhere to go and a channel to call. Thvas still looking at his feet. Dalvan still looking at the horizon. The 6 guards in a loose professional cluster, weapons stowed now, doing the post-operation recalibration thing that soldiers do when the operation is ended, in a way they hadn't anticipated. Everything in order. Turned northwest. I checked the waypoint bearing on my nav. I started walking. The mountain was cold, and the ground was solid under my boots, and the sky was blue-gray and enormous, and I could feel the gravity of the moon being about 80% of home, which made every step a little lighter than expected, which I had always liked about off-world work. The filter wrench in my pack was a comfortable weight. The handheld had 43% battery remaining, which was enough. The terrain descended from the installation's ridge, in a long, gradual slope. Loose gray scree for the first kilometer, then compacted ground, where wind-carved channels had laid down a crust of fine sediment over whatever geology was underneath. I picked the line with the best footing automatically. The way you do when footing has been a survival question, long enough that choosing it becomes flexive. The scree didn't give me any trouble. Verath-six's second plateau has a loose stone field that runs 60 kilometers and sits at a grade, would qualify as a serious mountaineering route on most compact worlds, and I had walked it 4 times before I was 15. This was not that. The descent opened into a valley after about 40 minutes. Wide and flat, a dry stream cutting through the center of it, the mountain above shrinking into proper perspective behind me. I could see the waypoint marker in the distance. A low equipment cluster, antenna array, the boxy silhouette of a transit shelter, probably unmanned. The log had listed it as an automated relay station, usually meant a comm panel, a landing pad, and a cargo-grade weather shelter. Fine. Behind me, after a while, I heard Orval Dan's voice on a comm frequency, clipped, controlled, the voice of a man who had learned something in 9 months underground and was applying it. He was calling the transit waypoint. He was giving the facility designation. He was speaking plainly. The wind picked up. The mountain's shadow moved across the ground. I walked through it and out the other side, and the sun, this moon's sun, small and white and high, hit my face, and I turned into it for a second with my eyes closed, just for a second, the way you do when you've been somewhere that didn't have it. Then I kept walking. The transit shelter was clean and sealed, and the comm panel inside was current generation, which was a mild surprise. I logged the contract closure through my agency's relay, time-stamped, with the signed maintenance log appended as documentation. I submitted the invoice. I sent the closing report to the agency's off-world contracts desk, with a note that the installation was in serviceable condition and that a qualified follow-on logistics contractor could maintain it, without a full reinduction if they had the master schedule, which I attached. Then I sat on the transit shelter's equipment bench with my pack between my feet and ate the other half of the ration bar and waited for whatever transport was coming. It was a 40-minute wait. Quiet, the way moons are quiet when they don't have much biology on them. Just wind, and the distant sound of the waypoint's antenna array, doing its slow automated rotation, and somewhere above me, the faint harmonic of an orbital approach that resolved, in about 20 minutes, into a mid-range cargo hauler, on a standard run that had apparently been diverted to collect a group from the Solithkos coordinates, and one logistics contractor from the waypoint. The pilot was a Kethari, a species I'd worked with before, 4-limbed, gray-scaled, efficient, and she didn't ask any questions about the job, which was the right instinct. She offered me a hot drink from the hauler's galley. I said yes. It was not good coffee, but it was hot, and I drank it looking out the hauler's port window at the mountain falling away below us, smaller and smaller, until it was just a ridge among ridges on a moon among moons, and then it was gone. 14 kilometers. Clear ground. No weather event, no native predators. I'd done harder walks on worse mornings and I was home for dinner, more or less. If you counted the trans hub at Verath, approach as close enough to dinner, and the standard end-of-contract ration pack as close enough to a meal. That was the whole of it.